I think our topic should be of interest to believers and skeptics alike, since Jesus was assessed recently for his relative influence on the world in a book called Who's Bigger by two American professors of computer science and statistics who developed a model to assess about 1,000 historical figures from Aristotle to Einstein to work out the rankings of historical figures in terms of their influence on culture and philosophy and ethics through history. Both of these professors are not Christians, but their model suggests that Jesus is the number one most influential figure in all of world history. They seem to be a little bit embarrassed about their own conclusion, since in various interviews with them, they describe Jesus as the most successful meme. I'm not sure I'd want to reduce Jesus to a meme, but that was their way of coping with the idea that he'd been so significant. So my point is, whether people believe in Jesus or not, to get your head around the figure of Jesus is a worthy thing to do for a citizen of the world. And of course, if you are a believer, it can be encouraging to hear his name constantly. But many questions are raised. The National Geographic Channel produced a documentary in which they claimed that a gospel had been found written by the betrayer of Jesus, Judas. And it turns out, unsurprisingly, that Jesus whispered the secrets to Judas and all the other 11 apostles were wrong. Now, no historian thinks Judas left a gospel, but you spend enough money on a documentary, you speak in sort of oblique ways, and you can make anything sound plausible. Not to be outdone, the Discovery Channel had their own multi-million-dollar documentary called The Lost Tomb of Jesus, in which they claimed to have found a tomb in South Jerusalem with a burial box in the tomb. The way Jews buried you in antiquity was leave you for a year, come back, wash your bones and place them in an ossuary, a burial box, and then write your name on the side. And they'd found a box with the words, Jesus. And the claim was this could be the family tomb of Jesus, which would be really problematic for classical Christianity, since the Jesus in this box was still in this box, and that's not meant to have happened. What they didn't make clear was that 1 in 6 people, men, was called Jesus in the first century, and so the chances of it being this Jesus very unlikely. And there were about 15 people in the tomb anyway, and it was nothing like the tomb the Gospels describe. But the thing is, you spend enough money on a documentary and you can make anything sound plausible. The new atheists of our day, Richard Dawkins, Michel Onfray, Christopher Hitchens, have written books, multi-million selling books, in which they give the impression that we either know nothing serious about Jesus or he didn't even live. So there's a lot of challenge to this apparently most significant figure. Some would even claim that the most significant figure in world history wasn't actually a figure of history. He didn't even live. Contrast that with the claim at the front of Luke's Gospel, which gives the very strong impression that this material comes from eyewitnesses, that he has investigated everything thoroughly from the beginning, and that he's written an orderly account so that you may know the certainty, the asphaleia in Greek, the surety, from which we get asphalt, right? The stuff roads are made of. The asphaleia, the certainty of the things you have been taught. So, on the one hand, you've got massive skepticism about Jesus. On the other, you've got the claim of the Gospels that this is from eyewitness material that you can be sure of. It's in this context that I want to offer you, I think, if we have time, 7 things you might want to know, whether you're a skeptic or a believer, about the study of Jesus. And I don't mean the study of Jesus going on in seminaries around the world, I mean the study of Jesus going on in universities around the world. The secular study of Jesus. Just because I'm in a Coptic church doesn't mean I'm going to try and get away with stuff that I can say in the safe environment of a Coptic church. I'm going to say stuff that I can and have said at Macquarie University or Sydney University where I teach. Stuff that is regarded as part of the consensus of historical Jesus studies. 7 things. Sound all right? Here we go. 1. Deep skepticism and Christian apologetics are minority positions in professional scholarship. The study of Jesus is a massive topic in historical studies. It's hard to convey just how many scholars, how many books there are on this topic. At Macquarie University, where I did my postgraduate studies, I'm pointing over here at section B, where all the historical Jesus books live, which is, I think, quite funny, because it's the first section as you go through the gates of Macquarie University. The first section is the Jesus section. I don't know what God's doing there. Maybe it's a little inside joke. There are more historical Jesus books in our library than there are books on Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar combined. Our ancient history department is the largest in the Southern Hemisphere. We teach courses on Alexander, we teach courses on Caesar, and we teach courses on Jesus. But what I'm saying is there would be more scholarly books on Jesus than on Alexander and Caesar combined. Which doesn't say, therefore, Jesus wins. Yay. It just means this is a vast field of serious academic study. And I say to my students, where I teach a course at Sydney University, that unless you've read at least 20 historical Jesus books, you won't even have a clue of the contours of the debate about the historical Jesus. Or alternatively, you sit through a 26 lecture hour course, and then you would have an idea of the contours of the debate, and they choose to do that rather than read the 20. But my point is, we are not dealing with Santa Claus or the Hobbit when we're talking about Jesus. There's a kind of irresponsible, internet-driven view that you can have any opinion about Jesus without actually reading the scholarship on Jesus. Now, the way I think about this vast scholarly field is along a kind of spectrum. Out on the left-hand side of the spectrum, and I don't mean left politically necessarily, you've got what you might call skeptical scholars. And I would say these are about 10% of scholars who have real PhDs, good credentials, but they ply the scholarly craft to debunk everything about Jesus. Out on the right wing, again I don't mean politically, are what you might call the Christian apologist scholars. They also have reputable credentials from good universities, but they ply the scholarly craft to prove everything about Jesus. And in fact, really, the skeptics and the apologists are just having a conversation with each other. They just lob bombs over to each other. But my point is, they would only represent 10% of scholars each. In the middle is, I think I'm saying conservatively, 80% of working scholars are not in it to disprove or prove Jesus, but to get on with the study of Jesus as a real figure of history that we can know some stuff about. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because the general public nearly only ever hears from the skeptical minority of scholars who are saying, maybe Jesus didn't live, or Jesus got married and had 3 kids and the descendants can still be found in France today. Dan Brown sort of stuff. That's exciting, and it gets media attention precisely because it's sensational. I don't think the media is out to get Christians. I just think they like what is not boring. And what is boring is, oh wow, we think Jesus probably was a first century teacher who ate and drank with sinners, who called disciples, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Boring, that's yesterday's news. Jesus married Mary Magdalene, now you've got my attention. Even though the data for that is almost non-existent. My point, though, is that both skeptics and Christian apologists are fringe scholars. The vast majority aren't trying to disprove or prove, just study Jesus as a real figure from antiquity. The second thing I want to say, of the 7 that I may get through tonight, is that non-Christian sources provide a basic outline of Jesus' life. There are 11 texts from antiquity that refer to Jesus written by non-Christians. They are, in the big Jesus tomes, all discussed, but everyone agrees only 3 or 4 of them are very significant. And 2 of them are most significant. They are Tacitus and Josephus. Tacitus, from whom we get most of our information about the imperial period. Tacitus is universally regarded as the best source for the imperial period. If you know anything about crazy Emperor Nero, you probably got it from Tacitus, via your ancient history teacher, probably, who got it from Tacitus. Very important source. And in passing, he refers to Jesus executed during the reign of Tiberius. You can see that Tacitus is not a fan of the Jesus movement. In fact, he says the deadly superstition thus checked for the moment broke out afresh not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world meet and become popular. Not a fan, but at least places Jesus in the right time, in the right place, executed in the right context. The other text that is the subject of enormous study and scholarship is from Josephus, who mentions Jesus on 2 occasions. Now, if you've done some internet research, in inverted commas, you will have discovered that there's lots of debate about this first paragraph on the screen from Josephus, in which Jesus is described as a wise man who performed surprising feats, etc. You will find people who argue the whole thing is a forgery, that some naughty Christian, copying out Josephus several hundred years after Josephus, inserted a paragraph because he wanted Jesus to be noted by this great Jewish writer from the 1st century. Then you'll occasionally hear an apologist try and say that the whole thing has come from the pen of Josephus. The truth is in the middle, as so often is the case. What I've put on the screen is what the consensus of scholars, Jewish, Christian or otherwise, regards as having come from the pen of Josephus. A neutral description of a teacher, a wonder worker named Jesus, who was crucified and whose movement didn't die away. The other reference to Jesus in Antiquities Book 20 is without any controversy in scholarship. It refers to the brother of Jesus, James. Some feel it better to think of him as half-brother, who was a leader in early Christianity and who was executed in the year 62 for his faith in Jesus, who was called Christ. These are just 2 of the others that we could explore. My point is, we would know a fair bit about Jesus, the outline of Jesus, even without a Bible. There probably wouldn't be whole courses on Jesus in universities based on these scraps of information, but he would be a figure that made an appearance in the various dictionaries and biographies of antiquity. Let me put it this way, perhaps starkly, but I think accurately. The consensus of professional scholars, Christian or otherwise today, is that Jesus' existence, his fame as a teacher and healer, his gathering of disciples, his execution under Pontius Pilate, are regarded as beyond reasonable doubt. That's the consensus. And there's a way of verifying the consensus. You can turn to the standard compendiums of secular scholarship on things ancient, like the Cambridge Ancient History or the Oxford Classical Dictionary. Now, if you know ancient history, you know these are the peerless compendiums of all the stuff we know from antiquity. The Cambridge Ancient History is 12 volumes long, and scholars refer to it as it's their Bible to remember facts and figures and information. And the Oxford Classical Dictionary is the best single volume account of all ancient history scholarship in a mere 1,600 pages. You can turn to these compendiums of secular scholarship, turn to the sections on Jesus, and you'll discover that no doubt whatsoever is raised about the broad outline of Jesus' life. None. So although it's true on the internet, you do sometimes hear people say, oh, now scholars don't think Jesus lived. You've only got to turn to what are regarded as the state-of-the-art compendiums of historical scholarship to discover that that just isn't true. I was so confident of this back in 2014, I wrote an article for ABC The Drum in which I challenged people that I would eat a page of my Bible if someone could find just one professor of ancient history, classics or New Testament in any real secular university anywhere in the world who thought Jesus didn't live. So I put that out there. The comment section was hilarious because people were sure I was going to eat my whole Bible, and they offered scholar after scholar after scholar. Professors of folklore, professors of English literature, professors of philosophy, even a professor of German language was offered, but no professor of ancient history, classics, or New Testament in any university in the world. I think my Bible is safe. Even though I'm prepared to eat Matthew chapter 1 on my Vegemite toast, so I can't taste it. I'd probably do it in front of a camera and put it on YouTube and say they found one of the perhaps 10,000 scholars they could choose from. They found one who thinks Jesus didn't live, but they haven't found one. Contrast this with a passing statement in The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. Now, I have great respect for Richard Dawkins and had the privilege of meeting him recently when I was on sabbatical in Oxford, and I went to a professor's dinner and drinky poos at New College where he is, and a lovely, lovely man. I genuinely feel great respect for him. But this line in The God Delusion is problematic. He says, a serious, if not widely held historical case can be made that Jesus never lived at all, as has been made by Professor G.A. Wells of London University. What he doesn't reveal is that G.A. Wells is Professor of German at London University. Professor of German. Now, look, it's probably statistically true that if you speak German, you're smarter than average, but that doesn't make you an expert in historical Jesus. G.A. Wells has no credentials in history, ancient languages, ancient philosophy, nothing, no theology, nothing relevant. He's just a really smart German-speaking guy. And you've got to ask yourself the question, what drives a highly intelligent and informed man like Richard Dawkins to quote a completely irrelevant scholar as justification for something no relevant scholar would sign up to? It seems to me that something more than the intellect is driving the new atheism of the moment. Now, to Richard Dawkins' credit, he, in a recent debate, was challenged on this very point, and he admitted that this was perhaps a flourish, a little bit of an exaggeration. I'm looking forward to future editions of The God Delusion that don't have this line. Well, from scraps of information written by non-Christians, we can be beyond doubt that the figure of Jesus really did live and die. But the reality is, these non-Christian scraps of information are not where the action is for secular scholars. And I want to pivot now to explain to you why secular scholars, that is scholars with either no faith at all, or scholars with faith but never engage their faith in their study of the texts, why such scholars take the New Testament evidence seriously. Why they don't think Josephus and Tacitus and Marabas, Serapion and Pliny and Suetonius and these other references are where the main game is. Why they see the New Testament as the best evidence we have for the historical Jesus. And I've got several points, and one of them is my third point tonight. The New Testament is the best attested text of classical antiquity. Now, even when I say that, I feel like that must be an exaggeration. Surely you can't say that. Surely that's the sort of thing you can only say in a Coptic church. In fact, no. This is something I could say at Macquarie University in the Ancient History Department, or at Sydney University Classics Department, and people would go, yeah, we know that. The New Testament is the best attested text in all classical antiquity. There is a popular myth that we don't really know what was originally in the scriptures, and that they were, maybe, changed, and what you read in a New Testament today can't bear any relation to what was in the original New Testament. But the reality is, we have so many copies and fragments of the New Testament that the sheer number of fragments and manuscripts that we have allows us to be very confident of what was in the original. The logic is this: if you have only maybe 1 or 2 copies of a letter, so maybe 2 or 3 documents in your hand that purport to be copies of the same letter, and several of the sentences throughout the letter differ in one or other of the letters. If you only have 2 or 3, it's very hard to judge which is the original and which is where the departures have taken place, right? What if you have 1,000 copies? You suddenly are very easily able to work out where the variations have taken place. The sheer number of copies allows you to discern where the mistakes have made, what are more likely to be the mistakes, and so on. Now, all texts, including the New Testament, have mistakes and variations in the copies, all of them. But because the New Testament is the most well-attested text in all of classical antiquity, we can be surer about the New Testament text than we can any other text of antiquity. I'll give you a classic example. Virgil's Aeneid is the most popular Latin text of the period in which the New Testament was written. And it is regarded as Rome's best attested text. That is, we have more copies of this than we do for any other text. We can put together Virgil's Aeneid, which is like an epic poem that kind of describes the history of Rome. And it's in 12 volumes. So when I say poem, don't think I mean like a Henry Lawson poem or something, right? It's 12 volumes. Now, we have the Aeneid in 3 complete or near complete manuscripts. But we have 7 partial manuscripts as well. And when I say partial, I don't mean scraps of like pages. I mean 2 or 3 of the books of the Aeneid would be a partial manuscript. We have 7 of these. And we have 20 papyrus fragments. These might be a page or 2 or 3 that we've found. And from this, we can be very confident of the original text. That's enough copies for us to go, yeah, we're pretty sure what was in the original. From this, we can be very confident of the original text. That's enough copies for us to go, yeah, we're pretty sure what was in the original. Now, I've deliberately chosen the best Latin text, the most well-attested Latin text. Let's compare it with the New Testament. Okay, so the Aeneid has 3 complete manuscripts. The New Testament has 4. So it compares pretty well, I think you'll agree. But where it gets very exciting is in the partial manuscripts. Partial manuscripts doesn't mean a scrap of paper. Partial manuscripts means all of the Gospels, or all of Paul's letters, or Acts and 5 of Paul's letters. I mean, these are large fragments, partial manuscripts. We have 340 of them, compared to the Aeneid's 7. What about papyrus fragments? Well, we have literally thousands. It's hard to estimate, there's debate about it, but some put it at about 5,000. But these are fragments, these are pages, this is what they look like. I got to play with 1 or 2 in Oxford recently. This is the oldest copy of James 3 on your left, and the oldest copy of John 18 and 19 on your right. On your right. So this is what a fragment looks like, and we have literally thousands of these. My point is this: the more copies and fragments that you have that you can compare, the more sure you can be about what was in the original. And, as I say, the New Testament is the best attested text of classical antiquity. So that's one of the reasons scholars like playing with the New Testament, because we can be pretty confident it was what was actually written originally. Here's my 4th point. The New Testament offers early evidence for Jesus. Early evidence for Jesus. People often say, but the Gospels were written decades after Jesus and so on, and that's partly true. But we live in a Twitter age, right, where if it's not on Twitter, by 7 p.m. tonight, I probably, don't exist, right? It's got to be that immediate. But in antiquity, we're used to sort of different kind of time frames. I'll give you some very fair examples. Alexander the Great dies 4th century BC, as you know. The first extant biography that we have of Alexander is Polybius, who writes 120 years after Alexander. 120 years. The best source, though, is not Polybius, but Arrian, who writes 400 years later. Now you may say, why on earth would you trust Arian 400 years later over Polybius? It's partly because Arian just seems more sensible than Polybius, and partly because Arian is using earlier sources that we can detect, sources that are lost to us, but Arian had them. Anyway, but they're the kind of dates that we've got to work with Alexander the Great. What about Tiberius, who ruled the world when Jesus lived? Our best source for him is the biographical account of Tacitus, whom I've already mentioned, the greatest of the imperial writers. And Tacitus writes 80 years after Tiberius has died. 80 years. And that's still pretty good. We still think Tacitus is our best way into understanding the life of Tiberius. Now look at the Jesus dates. Jesus dies about the year 30, depending on which side of a certain debate you fall on. The earliest New Testament text that we can date comes from 20 years after his death. And the latest text in the New Testament comes from about 60 years after his death. Now I say this, I'm giving you the secular dates. Personally, I think our latest text is a bit earlier than that, but most scholars would put the Gospel of John in the early 90s, okay? And so that's about 60 years after Jesus. Personally, I think John has to be dated pre-70, but I'm in a minority here. So I'm just flagging. The usual dates would place John around 90, maybe 93, something like that. But even still, even if you go with the late date, the last New Testament text is still closer in time to Jesus than our very best source for Emperor Tiberius. The last New Testament text is still closer in time to Jesus than our very best source for Emperor Tiberius. Which may not impress you, but it impresses ancient historians who are used to these kind of long-form dates and discover that the New Testament is a text that we know was written in living memory of the people involved with the events themselves. And in ancient history, that's pretty good. To put it in a nice little diagram for you, those who like seeing things, diagrammatically, Alexander, you've got to wait 120 years to get Polybius. Tiberius, you've got to wait 80 years to get Tacitus. Jesus, you've only got to wait 20 years to get complete writings about him. What's more, we have this. What's this? Well, it's a scrap from 1 Corinthians, and in chapter 15 there is what all scholars regard as a creed. Now I know in a Coptic context I don't need to explain what a creed is, but these sort of memory devices that epitomise important themes or ideas in Christianity were used from the very beginning. And the bit in yellow is universally regarded as the earliest creed that we have in Christianity. And it says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. And then it's the end of the creed and back to Paul writing his letter. Now scholars, even scholars like Gerd Ludemann and Robert Funk, both of whom are atheists, but experts in this material, will give a date for this creed of about the year 35. This is extraordinarily early, and it's a summary of Jesus' status as Christ, his death, that this was in accordance with the Jewish scriptures, that he was buried in a tomb, since kaihote etaphe means to be buried in a tomb, that he was raised on the third day, and that this is in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. All of that was already so well known, it found itself in an epitome or creed to be said by Christians by the year 35. I got to play with the earliest manuscript of this some years ago now. They're my little hands there with the little white gloves. And I can't resist showing you.
In this glass frame is the earliest example of Christian oral tradition. Here the Apostle Paul reminds the Corinthians of a fixed summary of the Christian faith which he passed on to them years earlier and which he himself had received shortly after his conversion. Mainstream scholars date this summary to within months of Jesus' death.
These words were in common Christian usage before the year 35.
Whatever else we may want to say about the basic plot of Jesus' life, it clearly wasn't a legend growing up over time.
This fixed summary, or creed, provides evidence that the broad narrative of Jesus' death, burial, resurrection and appearances was being taught and memorised decades before the details were written up in the Gospels.
Hoti Christos, apethenen, huper ton, hamartion, hemon, katatas gra.
Okay, he's just showing off now. So this 4-line summary of Christianity puts beyond reasonable doubt that the narrative of Jesus as Messiah, crucified, buried in a tomb, raised, appeared, had a collection of 12 disciples, that all of that was so well known by the middle of the 30s AD. There is just no way this core material can be a late accumulating legend. Whatever Christianity is, it isn't legendary. The date is just too early. The fifth thing I want to say relates to this. I've hinted at oral tradition already, since this little creed or epitome that I just cited was to be spoken out loud, memorized by Christians and spoken out loud as a mnemonic device. And it is very mnemonically devised in the original Greek. But this notion of oral tradition is crucial. And my point is that oral tradition amply bridges the gap between Jesus and the New Testament. We've only got a 20-year gap between Jesus and writings about him, which in ancient history is close to as good as it gets. But that gap can be bridged amply by what's known as oral tradition. One of the things that's hard for modern people to get their heads around is that ancient people preserved their most important traditions in memory and repetition. I know you sit there, perhaps, going, oh yeah, well, it could never have been sustained, it can't be reliable. But this is because you live in a literary culture. You live in a Twitter culture. And so immediacy is all important. Writing is all important. But we're pretty sure, based on studies of the period, that only about 10 to 15% of the population around the Mediterranean could read and write. 10 to 15%. So you try and put yourself in that context. Your first instinct, if you had important material to preserve, was not to write it down. That only preserved it for a minority of people. Your first instinct, if you really wanted to preserve it for the masses, was oral tradition. The careful memorization and repetition of your important material. Now, we have such overwhelming evidence for this, and I'll just give you 2 books that you could read if you want to pursue this. One's by James Dunn, Jesus Remembered. One's by Richard Borkham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. These are both very important analyses of the importance of oral tradition in antiquity applied to the study of Jesus. But I just want to give you just 2 bits of the massive evidence that we could mount for this. One is from the Jewish side, the culture in which Jesus grew up, the Jewish culture. This is what's called the Mishnah. The word Mishnah means repetition, and that gives you an idea of what's going on in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the collection of oral traditions of the Pharisees from about 50 BC to AD 200. You know how Jesus in the Gospels criticizes Pharisees for traditions that they hold to that don't come from the written scriptures? Yeah? Well, the New Testament gives ample evidence of that, but the Mishnah is the written version of all those oral traditions. My copy runs to 1,100 pages. It's 150 rabbis whose sayings have been memorized and only eventually written down in the year 200. Excellent evidence that if you were a Jew of the Pharisaic tradition in antiquity, to memorize the sayings and deeds of a teacher was a top priority. But what about from the Greek and Roman side? We have excellent evidence from Epicurus. Epicurus founded one of the great philosophical schools. Epicureanism, by the time of the New Testament, was one of the 3 most famous and important philosophical schools that you could attend. And the thing that I find fascinating is that to become a beginner in the Epicurean school, a beginner, you had to remember 2,000 words of Epicurus' teaching. Word perfect. It's the famous authoritative opinions. They are 40 paragraphs, and here are the first 4. A blessed and eternal being has no trouble himself and brings no trouble upon any other being. Hence he is exempt from movements of anger and partiality, for every such movement implies weakness. Of course. Second, death is nothing to us, for the body, when it is resolved into its elements, has no feeling, and that which has no feeling is nothing to us. 3, the magnitude of pleasure reaches its limit in the removal of all pain, and on it goes. That's just the first 4 of 40 you had to memorize to begin in Epicureanism. My point is the context in which Christianity grew, both on its Jewish side and its Greco-Roman side, was a context that valued oral tradition as the primary way of preserving and passing on. The difference between Christianity and the Jewish or the Greco-Roman tradition of oral tradition is that Christianity only had to do it for a few years, because pretty soon their material was written down. Six, the New Testament is a collection of sources. Now this may sound like the most boring thing I've said all night, which is quite a competition. But it's actually incredibly important for someone with a historical bent. The New Testament today is a single volume, admittedly. It has one ISBN if you buy it in a bookshop, right? But you need to forget that, because the New Testament documents were only bundled together into a single volume in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They were originally written separately from one another. This is highly important. When Mark wrote his gospel, he did not have copies of Paul's letters. When Paul wrote his letters, he did not have a copy of Mark's gospel. So these are 2 separate, independent sources. They are not, in a literary sense, dependent on each other at all. This is very important. In fact, this is a slide we spend an hour on in the, if you want to do it at a university course. But it hopefully illustrates that there are even sources within the Gospels that you can't even look up in a contents page. So the Gospel of Mark, I'm sure in a Coptic church you've all heard of the Gospel of Mark. Am I right? Indeed. Probably our earliest of the 4 Gospels, in the opinion of most secular scholars. Paul's letters, you've heard of those, yes. James, you've heard of that. But then it starts getting weird. They start naming things like M, Q, L, SQ. That just sounds bizarre. It's highly unimaginative scholarly abbreviations. Q is just short for the German word Quelle, meaning source. So they've called this source, right? And just to make it a little bit interesting, called it Q. SQ is the signs source in John's Gospel. M is just the special material in Matthew's Gospel. L is the special source within Luke's Gospel. Now you can forget about that as quickly as I've told you, but the point is this. There is a very wide consensus amongst scholars that we have at least 4, maybe 7, independent texts now bundled together in the New Testament. That is, sources that have not been copied from one another that are now pulled together in our documents and in the wider New Testament. Now, why this is so important is because it fulfills what is perhaps the most important criteria for analysing history. It's called the criterion of multiple attestation, which you can forget as soon as you hear it. But it basically means when numerous sources independently offer roughly the same portrait of an event or person, that portrait takes on greater plausibility. If you hear surprising news from one friend tonight, you may or may not believe it. Depends whether you trust the friend, right? But if you hear the same news from a second source and you're pretty sure that source hasn't copied the first source, you are more likely to believe it. 3 sources, you're getting pretty confident. 4 sources, you're willing to say it's probable. 7 sources, you're applying the criterion of multiple attestation. You're just not pretentious enough to call it that. You just call it common sense. And history operates on this common sense principle. And my point is this. Independently of each other, at least 4, maybe 7, sources that haven't been copied from each other offer roughly the same portrait of this teacher, healer, known as Jesus, who gathered disciples, who named him Messiah, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and whose disciples were adamant they saw him again after his death. When you have multiple attestation for that broad narrative, this is not proving the Jesus narrative, but I'm just trying to illustrate for you why secular historians still think there's something very substantial going on in the Jesus narrative. I have one last point. Archaeology supports the Gospel's portrait of Jesus. Archaeology. Right now, scores of digs are taking place all around the Mediterranean and in Israel, and some of them are yielding fascinating results for the study of the figure of Jesus. Now, the important thing to know about archaeology today is that none of it is religiously motivated. It's not like, a youth group activity, Let's go out and find something for Jesus, right? To be involved in a dig, you have to get Israel Antiquities Authority permission, which ain't easy, and you have to have a serious academic standard on site with some university backing. And what they're finding is pretty fascinating. And I want to give you a boring but incredibly significant example of archaeology. And then I want to give you some exciting but unimportant examples. And there's a life lesson right there. Let me give you the boring but incredibly significant finding of archaeology. The Gospels describe Jesus' homeland of Lower Galilee as profoundly Jewish. Do you agree? If you've read the Gospels, he's always arguing with Jewish people about Jewish things, quoting Jewish texts, fussing over Jewish laws and so on, right? And yet, all the New Testament documents, including the Gospels, are in Greek, not in Aramaic. So what's going on here? On the one hand, you've got a claim that he's Jewish, but it's in the pagan language. So maybe Jesus wasn't very Jewish. Maybe Lower Galilee was more pagan and Greek, and that those Jewish elements have just been added by the Gospel writers. Or maybe he was Jewish, but such a great distance has taken place between Jesus and when the Gospels were written that the Greek is a massive departure from the original Jewish Jesus. Do you see the dilemma? Archaeology has helped us out here enormously in the last 20 years. For one thing, we have uncovered overwhelming evidence that Lower Galilee was Jewish. Some scholars began to say that Lower Galilee, where Jesus was from, was more pagan, influenced by Cynic philosophy perhaps, and maybe the Jewish elements of the Gospels were later additions. That theory is now sunk. Because what we find in the towns mentioned in the Gospels, the towns of Lower Galilee, Capernaum, Bethsaida, Chorazin, etc., is profoundly Jewish. Here's a good example. This is a newly uncovered synagogue, just found 3 years ago, just opened 18 months ago to the public. The synagogue of Magdala, right on the lake. Jesus almost certainly taught here. Magdala is, of course, where Mary Magdalene was from. Mary Magdalene means Mary from Magdala. This is her hometown. This is her synagogue. It's in the orbit of Jesus' teaching ministry. He for sure taught there. This synagogue is from the time of Jesus. Now, we've not only found synagogues, which are a pretty good giveaway of Jewish culture, the burial techniques in these towns indicate Jewish burial techniques, the ossuary box that I mentioned at the beginning. Limestone bowls are found everywhere, which is a peculiar Jewish concern, to eat your food out of limestone. And in the rubbish dumps, you don't find pig bones, which is a sure sign that you've found a Jewish town, because everyone loved pork, right? But the Jews avoided pork for ritual reasons, and it's a pretty good giveaway of... Anyway, so definitely these towns are Jewish, but that might confirm that the Gospels get that bit right, that Jesus was from a very Jewish culture, but is the Greek of the Gospels itself at a great distance from the culture in which Jesus lived, which mainly spoke Aramaic? Well, archaeology has helped us here massively. People used to say that Greek and Hellenistic culture were great departures from the culture of Jesus in Galilee and Jerusalem. We now can't think that for several reasons. But one is that Jewish ossuaries, these burial boxes I've mentioned, name the loved ones and offer little writings on the burial boxes. A significant proportion of them, a minority, but a significant minority, are written in Greek. Jewish burial boxes in Jerusalem and Galilee, written in Greek. Sometimes in Greek and Aramaic, but we have ones that are just Greek, which tells you that many Jews had Greek as one of the heart languages. Based on writings and inscriptions found in and around Jerusalem, we calculate that about 15% of Jerusalem was Greek-speaking as a first language. But we know this is true of Jews as well. Here is a wonderful find. This is the great Theodotus inscription. This is from right in the shadow of where the Jerusalem temple sat. It is an inscription about a synagogue for Greek-speaking Jews in Jerusalem, in the shadow of the temple. And those of you who have Greek can see that this synagogue is for the reading of the law and the teaching of the commandments. This puts beyond doubt that Jews in Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, many were Greek-speaking. What this means is we now cannot say Greek language is at a great distance from a first century Jew from Galilee and Jerusalem. We can't say that anymore. It is entirely probable that some of Jesus' disciples were fluent Greek speakers. In fact, 2 of them had Greek names, Philip and Andrew. They probably also had Aramaic names. So the stories and teachings and deeds of Jesus were being put into Greek in his own lifetime. Okay, now that's perhaps boring, but really significant for scholars, right? Because it means that we're dealing with the Greek Gospels with a real text that can bring you into immediacy with a first century Palestinian Jew. Let me give you some trivial but exciting examples. Ready? Here's an inscription Pilate lovingly left for us, paying honour to himself. Pontius Pilate is mentioned in plenty of writings from antiquity. We're pretty sure he lived, but here it is in stone. And what's interesting about this is he names himself prefect of Judea. He doesn't call himself procurator, which is another term for governor. And the Gospels call him prefect, not procurator. So they get the title right. Even though the title, by the way, changed in the mid-40s, long before the Gospels were written. There's a pool in Jerusalem near the Sheep Gate, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. So says John chapter 5. But we dug around the Sheep Gate, or what we thought was the Sheep Gate, and not found it until they dug slightly to the left, and they found it. But in the period where they hadn't found it, some scholars went into print. I've gone and tracked them down. They went into print saying either John made a mistake or it was just a metaphor. Maybe the 5 covered colonnades, that's 5 rows of columns, were a metaphor for the first 5 books of the Old Testament, right? Amazing what scholars get up to when they've got too much time on their hands. But they found this thing, the only one of its kind, with 5 covered colonnades. You'd think people had learnt their lesson, because there's another pool in Jerusalem. Jesus is meant to have healed someone there. The pool of Siloam. But again, we dug up all around Siloam. We know where Siloam is. It's the suburb called Siloam now in South Jerusalem. We had found a 3rd century pool, but that couldn't be it, right? That was built 2 centuries after Jesus. But not this Siloam pool that Jesus is meant to have sent someone to be healed at. Then in just 2004, June 2004, which is like in history terms yesterday, they uncovered the largest Jewish bathing pool ever found, smack bang in the middle of Siloam, just deeper than they'd found before, because they were doing some sewerage works. Don't worry about what he's saying, I can say it better. Here are the sewerage works. They dug a little bit lower to fix the sewer and found these Herodian stairs. See the beautiful Herodian stairs? This is the giveaway that it's a first century pool. And there's an artist's impression of what it will look like when it's complete. It's the largest Jewish bathing pool yet found. There is a dispute over who owns it, and that's why they've sort of stopped the archaeology. But that's what it's going to look like. That's kind of fun. Here's another nice but trivial example. It's our only example of a house in Nazareth that we can date to the 1st century. 2009, Israel Antiquities Authority announced to the world that they'd found a house. This is very significant if you're into Nazareth studies, because we'd only found 3rd century stuff from Nazareth. Silos, burial tombs, what else? A wine press, but not a house that you can date to the first part of the 1st century. So this was kind of cool. Nazareth probably only had 100 houses, maybe a couple of hundred houses, tiny little town. But it's lovely that we've now found one. My final example before I wrap up is quite a bit after Jesus, but it's a piece of archaeology that demonstrates something that is often disputed in the popular world, but not really by scholars. And that is, was Jesus worshipped as divine in the early period? Okay. Now, if you read a novel like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, you'll get the impression that you often hear people repeat that says, "Oh no, Jesus was just a man when he lived," and it was not until Constantine in the 4th century who wanted a new religion, so he elevated Jesus to be a divine figure and insisted that the bishops who gathered together in Nicaea, the Great Council of Nicaea, to elevate Jesus to be God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father, and so on, for those who know their Nicene Creed. But we had literary remains that clearly worship Jesus as God, much earlier than that. But we've now got an inscription that declares Jesus as God. And I think God has a sense of humour because it was found in a maximum security jail in Megiddo in Israel. Right? The Gospels always say Jesus was a friend of sinners, and so it strikes me as pretty cool that underneath the maximum security jail of Megiddo is what has turned out to be the earliest church yet found. And in this little video I'm going to show you, you'll see the graphic of what the building looked like. This is before there were purpose-built churches. This is a period where they still were using villas, but the inscriptions give it away as Christian.
Megiddo is the site of the earliest church building yet found. This strategic trade city contains the remains of a Christian prayer hall dating to the 3rd century. It contains 3 mosaic inscriptions pointing to its Christian use. What's especially interesting is that this community was probably made up of Greeks and Romans, not Jews. One inscription commemorates a Roman army officer who contributed to the mosaic's construction. This is early physical evidence of the extraordinary reach of the Christian message. What started as an exclusively Jewish movement soon became a predominantly non-Jewish or Gentile movement, but the message stayed the same. One of the inscriptions refers to Jesus as a god. Okay, so here in the corner of the mosaic in this prayer hall, we have an inscription that tells us about a woman called Akeptus who offered this table, a reference to the table in the middle, probably the table where communion was had, in memorial of the God Jesus Christ. So here, if the chief archaeologist's dating is correct, early 3rd century, we have a clear reference to Jesus as divine, almost a century before the Council of Nicaea, before Constantine. The early Christian symbol of a fish also appears on the mosaic floor. The Greek word for fish, ichthus, is an anagram of the words Jesus Christos Theohuios Soter, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Saviour. Contained in this symbol is the twofold message of historic Christianity: Jesus' status as the Christ or Son of God, and his mission as the Saviour, the one who died for the forgiveness of the world.
Here's a nice close-up of the inscription for those of you who have Greek. It's an amazing inscription. See the words that look like they are underlined? They are actually overlining the words beneath it. Overlining was a thing before underlining was a thing, okay? And this just tells you, here are the most important words of the sentence. And it says, Captus, the lover of God, dedicates this table, and the words that are overlined are to God Jesus Christ. Not God and Jesus Christ, God Jesus Christ. Smack bang in the middle of Israel is this most amazing find. And I've just heard last week that they've decided to move the prison. It's so significant. So they've covered it with dirt, which is just the best way to preserve material. It worked for nearly 2,000 years. It's going to work for 5 more years. They've covered it, and they're going to move the jail and then see what they can find. The preliminary report has given the year 232, so 100 years before Council of Nicaea, or thereabout. But Yotam Tepe, the chief archaeologist, when I visited the site, said the final published date will be before the year 200. So it's well before Constantine. Now, this doesn't prove that Jesus was God, but it does demonstrate that much earlier than the Council of Nicaea and Constantine, Christians were already worshipping the God Jesus Christ and doing it around a meal. Yeah? Sounds kind of familiar. And, you know, to be honest, just to break out of historian mode for a second, to stand in that spot, on that inscription, where my brothers and sisters 1800 years earlier had worshipped, was probably the greatest privilege of my life. It just made the imagination run wild to think of the continuity of content between the earliest centuries and today. Well, these are the 7 things that I've said today, in case you were wondering. Deep skepticism and Christian apologetics are minority positions in professional scholarship. Non-Christian sources provide a basic outline of Jesus' life. The New Testament is the best attested text of classical antiquity. The New Testament offers early evidence for Jesus. Oral tradition amply bridges the gap between Jesus and the New Testament. The New Testament is a collection of sources, and archaeology supports the Gospels' portrait of Jesus. Much more can and should be said, perhaps. You can all enrol in Sydney University course, Historical Jesus to Written Gospels, and get 26 hours of this fun and games. But for now, that will do. Thank you very much.